The renowned feminist theologian Phyllis Tribble labels the story that we just heard as one of the Bible's texts of terror, stories where acts of great violence and injustice are perpetrated against women. These are not the kind of stories that usually make it into the rotation of readings that we hear on an average Sunday morning. This may well have been your first time ever hearing this story. And if you're anything like me, upon hearing it, one of your first thoughts was probably, why in the world did they include this story in the Bible? It's a valid question. I can only imagine the number of editors throughout the centuries who suggested that maybe these particular verses simply be struck from the record. And yet, that didn't happen. Why? Well, I think that there are many answers to that question, but the one that most readily comes to mind is the fact that the Bible is many different things. It is most certainly an aspirational and inspirational collection of writings that seek to help guide us into better ways of living. But the Bible also paints a stark and at times harsh picture of the reality of the world in which we live. And the reality of the matter is that someone is sexually assaulted in our nation every 68 seconds. Over the course of their life, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men will experience sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner. And 1 in 6 women will experience an attempted or completed rape. The statistics vary depending on where you get your information, but what does not change is the fact that this is a very real problem. So that explains why it's in the Bible, but it doesn't explain why we're talking about it right now. There's plenty of stuff in the Bible that doesn't get airtime in church. So why should this story be any different? Because when we refuse to talk about something, just because it's difficult or uncomfortable, that doesn't make the problem go away. All it ends up doing is making the topic into a taboo subject, pushes it into the shadows, causes increased pain and shame for those who have experienced it, and only serves to perpetuate the problem. This has been shown time and time again with all manner of things. Churches that more openly and honestly talk about money and finances are usually more financially stable than churches that refuse to talk about them. For decades, people were afraid to talk about suicide with people who were depressed for fear of putting the idea into their minds, but research shows that talking about it actually reduces the risk. And so especially as we begin this month of domestic violence awareness, it's important for us to talk about these things. The story that we heard today is one that is all too common for many in our world and throughout history. The first thing that struck me is that Amnon is named as King David's son, while Tamar is simply described as being Absalom's beautiful sister, even though she was also one of King David's children. So right off the bat, the two are placed on very unequal footing. One is the son of the king, and the other is the sister of a son of the king. We're told that Amnon lusted after Tamar so greatly that he made himself sick. So after plotting with his friend, the two devise a plan. He would pretend to be sick and ask the king to have Tamar come and feed him out of her hand, yet another act of dominance and control. When she does this, however, he grabs her. She protests, but he doesn't listen, and he rapes her. Immediately after, he is disgusted by her, and we're told that this disgust is even greater than the lust he felt before. He has a servant dress her, kicks her out, and locks the door behind her. And in doing so, he perpetrates one final act of violence against her by dressing her back up in the long robe that signified her virginity. Now, obviously, he does this to cover his tracks, but can you imagine how that must have felt to Tamar? to have gone through this terrible ordeal, to have been violated by someone that she knew and loved, her brother of all people, only then to be dressed up again as a virgin, as if nothing happened. She couldn't bear it. She put ashes on her head, tore her robe, and went away in utter despair. While I was in seminary, I took a class called Sexual and Domestic Violence, and the main book for the class was by Marie Fortune, and it was called Sexual Violence, the Sin Revisited. I, like many broke seminary students, decided to buy the book used off of Amazon. And what arrived in my mailbox that day forever changed my life. When I flipped through the pages, I saw that the previous owner of the book had highlighted and written notes all throughout the book. At first glance, it was just a blur of bold pink ink. But as I began to read, it all came into focus. The previous owner of this book had been raped by at least one, but potentially two men. Throughout the pages, there were notes saying things like, "This is exactly what happened to me, and this is exactly how I was made to feel." My heart ached as I pieced together her story from the short notes that were left in the margins of this book. But what truly broke my heart was reading about her experiences with the church. She was made to feel as though it must have been her fault. She was told that there is no such thing as rape in marriage, that good Christians don't get raped. She was told that she should take her pain and her grief somewhere else because we don't talk about that kind of stuff in church. For her, the church was not a safe space. There was no sanctuary for her. It only served to further victimize and traumatize, which is why we need to talk about these kind of things. Why we need to believe survivors when they muster up the courage to tell their stories. Why we as Christians need to take a firm stance and denounce the evils of rape, sexual assault, domestic and intimate partner abuse, to label them as the sins that they are, to fight for justice, and to work for prevention. There's a story in that book that we used for the class where the author tells of a Lutheran pastor who announced to his congregation that he would be attending a 4-week training on sexual and domestic violence. At the end of the training, he told the group that he was meeting with great distress, that in just the past few weeks, 1 rape and 2 cases of incest had occurred in his congregation. He was shocked by this sudden outburst that had occurred. But as he discussed this with the group, he came to realize that this wasn't an outburst at all. It had always been there, but it was only now that his congregation felt like they could come forward and talk to him about it. That story blew me away, but it didn't quite sink in until a few weeks after the class ended. My congregation in Chicago had asked me to share some of the things that I had learned. So one Sunday morning, I led a Bible study before worship and then gave a presentation during the coffee hour. I posted on Facebook about this, asking for prayers, because, to be honest, I was terrified about how it would go. In the days that followed, I had 2 friends from the seminary reach out to me to share their personal experiences with abuse, stories that I had absolutely no idea about. This is not something that happens to other people out there in the world somewhere. It happens right here. It affects the people that we know and love and see on a daily or weekly basis. And it doesn't always follow the stereotypes that we have about these kind of situations. One of my best friends was in a domestic violence relationship with his roommate that involved both physical and psychological abuse. And try as I might, there was nothing I could do to convince him to leave. Regardless, though, of whether or not we are successful in our attempts, we are still called to try and help. The first and most important thing that we can do is trust and believe someone when they come to us with their story. False reports do happen, but they are so rare. And so many instances go unreported every year for fear that they will not be believed. We also need to ask the survivor how they would like to be supported. The Bible story for today cuts off before we can see this, but Absalom responds to what all had happened by killing Amnon. Too often, the response that survivors get when they finally muster up the courage to tell someone are vows of violence and retribution aimed against the perpetrator, when that is usually the last thing that the person actually wants. And we can also support the work of domestic violence support networks and advocacy groups that are already active in our community. I had the privilege of visiting the new One Safe Place North facility in San Marcos a few weeks ago. It is a wraparound services location that aimed at providing all the resources that a person might need in one single place. Survivors speak with case managers to undergo threat assessment to determine their level of safety. We were told about 4 women who couldn't explain why their partner just seemed to show up wherever they went, only to discover that their partners had been using tracking devices. 3 were on their cars, and 1 was placed in a bracelet that had recently been given to their child. There's access to lawyers who can help with everything from restraining orders to divorce, as well as financial and immigration matters. There's an option for people to appear in court via Zoom so that they don't have to stand in the same courtroom as their abuser. There are therapy services that include talk, art, and music therapists. Palomar Health has a wing there where they perform the physical exams that happen after an assault has taken place. And every exam room has a shower, and each person is given a fresh pair of clothing to change into. There is a clothing boutique, a hair salon, a teaching kitchen. There's access to law enforcement from all the major departments around North County, and so much more. In just the first month that they were open, they served 400 clients. The work that they are doing is absolutely amazing. And one of the most important things that we can do is support existing facilities like this one, as well as push for legislation and funding to create more. But what do we do with this Bible story? I was taught to always look for the good news in any passage and to make sure that that good news got proclaimed from the pulpit. So is there any good news in this story? Any silver lining that we can find to try and save it? My answer to that question is a resounding no. There is no good news in this story. The good news happens here, right here in this space, where we have broken the silence about a subject that for too long has been suppressed and avoided by mainstream society. The good news happens when we stand up and denounce actions like this. When we say that we are all beloved children of God and no one has the right to violate what God has looked upon and called good. The good news happens when we have the courage to examine these stories that break our hearts. And the good news happens when we carry all of that with us out into the world. When we do not let it reside simply within the walls of this congregation, but when we bring it with us to our jobs, our schools, our community centers, and our friend groups. Because we have a responsibility and a duty to do all that we can to prevent abuse from happening. And we are called to make the church a safe place for survivors to share their stories and to find healing, so that no one will ever again have to write their story in the margins of a book because they have nowhere else to turn to. Amen.